Welcome to another AWS hands-on tutorial. In this video, I'll walk you through creating a Spring Boot CRUD app and deploying it to AWS using Elastic Beanstalk. As a note, I'll be working on an M1 Mac and will be using IntelliJ for my IDE and MySQL running inside of MAMP on my local machine. If you're on a Mac with Apple Silicon and need to install MAMP, I have a video in my LAMP stack playlist that walks you through this. And if you need to install Java, Maven, or IntelliJ, I have a video in my intro playlist which you may find helpful. I'll put links to both videos in the description below. To begin, I'll launch MAMP, which will launch MySQL, and go into Preferences and show you that the MySQL port is listening on 3306. Then I'll go ahead and start the MAMP server. With MAMP up and running, I could go ahead and launch MySQL Workbench, and then test a local connection. Now, I'll go ahead and create a database for my Spring Boot app, which will be used to store information on personal contacts. So in the SQL tab, I'll execute the code to create a database named contact_db, and then I'll use the database. Then with the database created, I'll create a table named contact, which will have an ID, which is a big int, is not null, is the primary key, and will be auto-incremented. Then I'll have a contact name, which is a varchar 255, and not null. A contact email, also varchar 255 and not null. And then a contact cell, which is a varchar 12. Now I'll go ahead and run the SQL. And it looks successful. If I go over the schemas and then I refresh, now we see the new database and the table with our columns. Now, with the database created, I'll focus my attention on building the application. Since this is going to be a Spring Boot app, I'll head over to the Spring Initializer at start.spring.io and create a Spring Boot project. I'll leave Maven project and Java selected. I'll take the default for Spring Boot, and then I'll enter my project metadata. I'll leave the packaging as jar, and I'll change the Java version to 8 because that's the JDK I'll be using when developing. Now I'll add the dependencies to my project. I'll add Spring Web, MySQL Driver, Spring Data JPA, and Lombok. And now I can go ahead and generate. Now I'll jump into my Downloads folder and extract the zip file. Then I'll move the Contacts folder over to the folder that I do my development in. Now I'll launch IntelliJ, click Open, navigate to the folder I just extracted from the zip file, and then Open. Okay, now that the app is loaded, I'm going to go ahead and create a few more packages. So I'll create one named Model, one named Controller, one named Service, and one named DAO for the data access objects. Starting with the model package, I'll create a new class named Contact to model the contact table in the MySQL database. I'll give it the entity annotation and set the table name equal to contact. And I'll add the data annotation from Lombok, which will handle the getters and setters for us so we don't have to create them ourselves. And I'll add attributes to the class based on the contact table definition. We have an ID attribute, which is long. It's annotated as ID and generated value with a generation type identity strategy for the auto-generated index in the database. We have a string name, which is annotated as a column and set to the contact name column in the database and nullable false. Email is set to the contact email column in the database. It's also nullable false. And the cell is set to the contact cell column in the database. Now I'll move over to the controller package and create a class named Health Controller for the application health check. I'll add the annotations for REST controller and cross origin. Then a method for the health check route, which will return a response entity with status OK, which is a 200 response code. I'll also create a contact controller, which will handle requests for contact data in the database. This tool will get the REST controller and cross-origin annotations, and will have methods for exposing endpoints for interacting with the database. But before I create the methods in this class, I'm going to jump over to the service package and create a contact service, which will be used by the contact controller. And I'll give this a service annotation. And before I build out the contact service class, I'll head over to the DAO package and create a contact DAO interface, which will extend JPA repository. The entity will be a contact, and the primary key is of type long. Now I'll go back to the contact service and auto-wire the contact DAO. And then I'll add the methods. I'll start with the add contact method, which takes an instance of a contact object, calls save on the DAO, and then returns the contact. Then I'll add a get contact by ID method, which takes an ID, and will return an instance of a contact if it's found in the database, or throw an exception with the message indicating that the contact wasn't found. I'll add a method to get all contacts, which will return all contacts from the database, and then an update contact method, which takes a contact ID and an instance of the contact with updated data. This method will first have to find the contact in the database using the ID which is passed in, and if it's not found, it will throw a new exception with a message indicating that the contact couldn't be found. If it is found, then I'll set the properties on the existing contact using the getters on the contact object which was passed in. Then save the existing contact and return it. Finally, the delete method takes a contact ID. Again, it'll check for an existing contact. If it's not found, it'll return a contact not found message. Else, it will delete the contact from the database using the ID which is passed in, and then return the existing contact for reference. Now I'll head back over to the contact controller and auto-wire the contact service. And now I can add the methods to implement the REST mappings. I'll start with the get contacts method, which is a get request to /contacts, and will return a list of contacts using the get contacts method in the contact service. Then I'll add a get request mapping to /contact to retrieve a single contact from the database. This will be handled by the get contact by ID method, and it will take a request parameter named contact ID, which will be referenced inside of the method as contact ID. Then I can call the get contact by ID method on the contact service, passing the contact ID, then return the new contact and a 200 status code. Now I'll add a post mapping for /contact, which will be implemented in the add contact method, which takes a request body with the data for the contact. This will take the contact and pass it to the add contact method in the contact service, then return the new contact and the status created. The patch mapping to /contact will be to update a contact and implemented in the update contact method. This takes a request mapping of the name contact ID and a request body for the new contact. Both the contact ID and the contact will be passed to the update contact method in the contact service. Then the updated contact will be returned and the 200 status code. And finally, the delete mapping to /contact is implemented in the delete contact method, which takes a contact ID, which is passed to the delete contact method in the contact service, which will return the deleted contact and the 200 status code. Now, we have one more file to look at before we can run the application, and that's in the resource folder and the application properties file. And in here, I've set some properties for the application. So I've set the data source URL to the JDBC MySQL driver. It's pointing to localhost port 3306, because as you'll remember, that's the port that MySQL is running on. And I'm pointing to the contacts database. The username and password for the database are the MySQL defaults root. Of course, you'll want to make these more secure, especially when we deploy to AWS. And I'm setting the Spring JPA database platform equal to the MySQL 5 dialect in Hibernate. And finally, I'm setting the port the application is going to listen on to 8080. Now if we go over to the contacts application and run it, we'll see that it was started successfully. And if we jump in a browser and go to localhost 8080/contacts, we see we get an empty array back because we don't yet have any contacts in the database. Now I'm going to jump over to Postman and test all our routes. And I'll start with the health check route in the health controller. So that'll be a GET request to localhost 8080/health. And that looks good with a 200 response. Now I'll switch over to contacts and we get the empty array back just like we saw in the browser. And now we'll do a post to /contact, which will allow us to add a contact to the database. So if I enter some JSON with values for the name, email, and cell, and then send, we get a status 201 created, and the contact is sent back with the ID. And now if we go back to the GET request to contacts, we see our one contact. Now I'll add another contact. This time I won't send the cell, because when we created the database, only the name and the email were not null. So now we see we have a contact with an ID of 2 and the cell is null. So if I grab this data, then jump over and do a patch request to localhost 8080/contact and pass the contact ID of the contact I want to update, I'll send name, email, and this time I'll add a cell. If I execute this, we see we get the contact back, this time with the cell. And if we jump back to our original GET, now we see both contacts, and the second contact has been updated with the cell. And finally, if I make a delete request sending the contact ID, we get a status 200 OK. The contact was returned, and if we go back to our original GET for contacts, now we see we only have one contact in the database. Alright, so we're in pretty good shape with our app running and tested locally. So now it's time to jump over to the AWS console. And before I create the Elastic Beanstalk environment to host the app, I first want to jump into RDS and create a database. So from the RDS dashboard, I'll click Create Database. I'll use Standard Create and select MariaDB, and then make sure to use a free tier template. For the DB instance identifier, I'll add a unique name. For credential settings, I'll change the master username to root and add a password of password123. Of course, you'll want to make this more secure, but this is good enough for the demo because I'll be deleting the database and the environment after I create the video. Confirm. Under connectivity, I want to make this public. Under additional configuration, I'll verify that the port is 3306. And under additional configuration, I'll give the database a name. And this is the name of the database that we used on our local machine, so I'm going to keep it consistent so I don't have to change this in the code. And now I'll create the database, which will take a little while. Okay, now that the database is available, I'll click into it, copy the endpoint, then go back to the code. And what I want to do is I want to replace localhost in the data source URL with the endpoint to the RDS database. It's still running on port 3306 and the database name is the same. I also need to change the password from root to password123. Now if I save this and launch the application, it doesn't look like it's connecting and it looks like it's going to time out, which it did. So I'll jump back over to the RDS console, find the security group, and open it in a new tab. Now on the inbound rules, I want to edit and add a rule for MySQL, and for the demo, I'll just set the source to anywhere and then save. Now back in IntelliJ, I'll run it again. And this time the application started and we were able to connect to the database. However, if I go over to Postman and I execute a GET request on localhost 8080 to the contacts route, I get an internal server error on path to contacts because although I created the RDS database and I can connect to it, the contact table doesn't exist yet. So to resolve that, I'll jump into MySQL Workbench and create a new MySQL connection, I'll give it a name of RDS, go back to the console and grab the endpoint, paste that in, leave it on 3306, the username's root, test the connection, and give it the password. And we see we can establish a connection to the database. And we successfully made the connection. So I'll click OK, and then open the connection. And now I'll add the SQL to use the contact database and create the contact table. And we've successfully created the contact table with the columns in the RDS database. So now if we jump back over to Postman and send the GET request to contacts, we see our status 200 and the empty array because we haven't yet put any data in the database. Alright, so things are looking really good now. So it's time to build the jar file for the application and deploy it to Beanstalk. However, before I do that, there's one more code change I need to make in the app config, and that's to change the server port from 8080 on local to 5000 for Beanstalk. I'll save it. Now I'll head over to Maven and run the install. Alright, and the jar file was successfully built. So now it's time to jump into Beanstalk and set up the environment. In the Elastic Beanstalk console, I'll click Create Application, give the app a name, choose the platform, which will be Java. I'm running on Java 8, and then I'll configure more options to connect to our database. In the database section, I'll click Edit, provide the username and password, save, and then create the app. This will take a little while, so I'll pause the video and come back when it's built. Alright, so now the Beanstalk environment's created, the health check looks good, we can go ahead and upload and deploy the code. So I'll click Upload and Deploy, choose the jar file, give it a version label of 1.0.0, and deploy it. Okay, with the application deployed successfully, I'll copy the endpoint, jump back over to Postman, replace localhost with the endpoint, and do a GET request to the contacts route. And that looks like it's clocking, so actually I need to get rid of this port. Try again. And now we get a status 200 with the empty array. So now let's try a post request to the contact route, and we'll send it some JSON to create a new contact with only the name and the email. We get a 201 with a contact returned, so let's jump back to our GET request, and we see we get our contact and the cell is null. So now we'll do a patch to contact, passing the contact ID, and this time we'll include the cell number. So that gives us a status of 200, and if we request contacts again, now we see our contact was updated with the cell number. And finally, we'll do a delete, passing the contact ID. Again, we get a status 200, the contact was returned, and if we do a GET for the contacts, we're now back to an empty array. So it looks like our application was successfully deployed and is running in the Beanstalk environment. Now the last thing I want to do in the Beanstalk environment is to select the application, click Actions, and terminate the environment. Okay, now the environment's terminated. And the cool thing is, if we jump over to RDS, we see we still have the database. And that's the reason that I created the database outside of the Beanstalk environment. We only connected to the existing database from the Beanstalk environment. Because if the database had been created inside the Beanstalk environment, when we terminated the environment, we would also have terminated the database. And we don't want to lose the data in the database. That's why I created it as an external RDS database. And if I launch MySQL Workbench, connect to RDS, I could select star from the contact table, and although we don't get any data back because we deleted the one contact that we put in when we were testing the application in Beanstalk, we do get a successful response back from the database because it's still up and running. So now I'll just go ahead and delete the database. So that concludes this demo of creating a Spring Boot CRUD app and deploying it to AWS using Elastic Beanstalk. I hope you found this helpful.